Публікації та зустрічі з відомими британськими науковцями, митцями, журналістами і політичними діячами. Цього вечора наш гість – відомий у світі журналіст. Довгий час редактор міжнародного відділу газети «Таймс» та провідний закордонний журналіст цієї поважної газети Майкл Бініон. Отже, пан Бініон виступить сьогодні з лекцією, яка звучить так. Як нові технології та соціальні медіа змінюють журналістику. І я з великим задоволенням передаю слово нашому гостю.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I am enormously honored and flattered that so many of you have come here and are prepared to stand to listen to me talking. This is unbelievable and a great honor. And it makes it all the nicer to come back to Kharkiv for the second time in 5 years. I came here 5 years ago and spoke about relations between Ukraine and the European Union. And it's nice to come back. It's also nice to come back to Ukraine almost 30 years since I first came here. I used to be a correspondent in Moscow in the Vremya Zastoy, the Brezhnev years, and I came down to Ukraine twice during that time. I didn't come to Kharkiv then, I went to Kiev and Odessa, and I had a very interesting time. But when I come back now, it's a different world completely. And I have to say, it's a much bigger and better and nicer world now than it used to be. Well, tonight I want to talk a bit about the new media and about the influence of new media on journalism and particularly on how a newspaper such as the Times uses new media, or should I say doesn't use new media, because I think this question of how to use Facebook or how to use blogs and the uses of the many uses of the internet is something that very many journalists and very many newspapers haven't yet understood. Facebook, as we can see, has launched a revolution already in Egypt. If it wasn't for Facebook, President Mubarak would probably still be in power. But nobody really understands how Facebook works. At least the security agents didn't understand it. Otherwise, they would not have allowed this revolution to get the momentum that it has acquired. It's also, I have to say, not really understood properly in much of Britain, because the new media are very much a phenomenon of the younger generation. Anybody under 30 automatically thinks it important to have a connection through Facebook. Almost nobody over 50 has a blog or a post on Facebook. It's a complete divide according to age. And for this reason, newspapers have the same problem. I don't have a Facebook entry, and I'm not going to have one. But then that means I'm not going to be determining how journalism will act or will look in 30 years' time. The problem is mostly for old-fashioned printed newspapers. They are being challenged in a way they have never been challenged before. Printed newspapers are facing at least 2 or 3 challenges, and the Times is the same as all of them. The first challenge is the rise in costs. It's becoming very expensive to run a newspaper. Paper is expensive. It's very expensive to keep foreign correspondents overseas. The Times has 18 correspondents in about 10 countries. We have, for example, correspondents in Paris, in Rome, Berlin, Moscow, Tokyo, United States, India, China, Japan, all the places you would expect. But we also have to keep correspondents in places where there are wars and conflicts. At the moment there are 2 correspondents in Libya, one with Gaddafi and one with the opposition. And we also have a permanent correspondent in Iraq. This costs a lot of money. not only must you pay for transport and hotels, but you have to pay for protection. It means armor plating, it means armored cars, and it means bodyguards, because the number of journalists who've been killed in wars is quite a lot. Well, newspapers find their costs are rising, and you have two possibilities. Either you stop writing about foreign news, or you put up your price, or you will lose circulation. And the problem also is that at the same time that costs are rising, advertising is going down because of the recession. Maybe it will come back again, we don't know. But advertising for most newspapers, certainly in Britain, is extremely important. It costs much more to produce a newspaper than the price of selling it. We sell it for £1 for the Times. It costs more than twice as much to produce each edition. And of course the Times, like all other newspapers, is now available on the internet. And the problem for the owners of the Times is that nobody under the age of 30 wants to buy a newspaper. Why should we buy a newspaper when we can read it for free on the internet, is what people say. And the reason it is free is because everybody else has put their newspaper free on the internet. Well, the Times is owned by a very big international press tycoon. You've probably heard of him, Rupert Murdoch. And he has decided nobody can have their news for free. If he has to pay all this money to produce a newspaper, then people have to pay to read it. And so 5 months ago, he put a barrier on the internet to make sure that if you want to read a newspaper on the internet, you have to pay. Not a lot of money. It's about £2 for 7 days. That's about €3. It's really not very much compared to other things, when one big coffee costs almost the same amount. And young people don't care at all about buying a cafe latte in a Starbucks, but £2 to read newspapers? No, that's much too much. So we do have a problem that if everybody reads the newspaper on the internet, sooner or later nobody will buy a copy. And newspapers across Britain, and not only there, but also in America and elsewhere, are wondering how to use the internet in a way to make money. How can you get advertising? How can you bring in income? They haven't found the answer yet. The other difficulty facing newspapers is not only rising costs, but the fact that all journalists now have to try to keep up on a 24-hour cycle. News is no longer something that's once a day. Well, newspapers are no longer once a day. Of course, nowadays, most people get their news not from newspapers, but from radio and television. 40 years ago, when television began, everybody said, that is the end of newspapers. Nobody will buy one anymore. It was not true then, and it's not true now. The reason is that newspapers now are not giving you the first news. They are giving you the news you already know, but they're telling you why and how and when. They're giving you the background, some analysis and some comment. And that is a function that television can't usually cover. But the problem is, television in many countries is now 24-hour news, like CNN or BBC World Service. It's all the time. And so if newspapers want to compete online, they also have to become like news agencies. They have to be 24-hour operations, which means the poor journalist has no time to talk to anybody, because all the time he's having to put a news story on the online edition. And the danger, there is a big danger, that journalists will become lazy, and instead of talking to people and going on the street or going to meetings or going to look at something, they will simply get their iPhone or open their computer and say, what's on the internet? What can I find there? And we are going to have a kind of journalism that is completely bloodless, with no real feeling or smell of what it's like. I don't think journalism is real journalism unless you can smell it. If you can smell garlic in France, then you know it's French. But if you can't smell it and you can't feel it, and if it looks like something that's come straight off a blog or a website, you can't be sure that this is authentic. And this is the other big problem about using new media as sources of information. You cannot be sure who is writing the blog, or who is putting out the tweet, or who is posting some new post on Facebook. It may be somebody who's extremely thoughtful and very intelligent, or it may be a complete idiot, and usually it's the second. Sometimes you wonder who has the time to spend all the time putting out tweets. If they're doing this all the day, aren't they running the country or doing something more sensible? It's extraordinary that the former Prime Minister's wife, Sarah Brown, is using tweets and Twitter on a daily basis to put out news. And you think, my goodness, if we get this soon from Prime Ministers or Prime Ministers' wives, what are they doing for the rest of the time when they're meant to be running the country? It is a very, very time-consuming process. And the problem about using this as a source of information is that you have no time to do anything except read what is written electronically. And that, I think, is a great danger to journalism. It's also a danger because you cannot assess or balance how valid this entry or this blog is compared to that one. Now, online there are some excellent blogs, especially. Some people have set up an enormous following, and effectively they've become amateur journalists or even professional journalists who are doing perhaps a better job than many newspapers. But there are many of these, and the question is, which one should you read? If you are the general public, it's perfectly reasonable to say, I'm going to read this blog and this blog and this Facebook entry. But if you are a journalist and you're trying to find out what's happening, you should really be doing it yourself. You shouldn't be just reading blogs. You need to go out there and do the blogging or do the investigations yourself. This is why most journalists really don't know what to do with new media. Nowadays, to be a trained journalist, you have to be able to perform in all operations. Not just to write something, but you have to look at the camera and be able to give a speech to the camera. Or you have to be able to take out your iPhone and write something quickly on that, or do some television or some radio. Because more and more, all these media are going to mix up and be complementary with each other. And that, in a way, is a very good thing. That's a very, it means that you're much more versatile. You will have a much better opportunity of communicating with the public than if you say, oh, I can only write on newspapers. Now, believe it or not, we still have one or two correspondents who cannot even type. They are still writing by hand. This is not journalists, but it is some commentators. We have one old former editor of the Times who has not yet learnt how to use a typewriter, and he writes his copy by hand and dictates it to a person who is taking that down. Now, this is from 1900 or something like that, but he is an exception. Most people at least can use a computer, and most people at least can master how to use the internet for their benefit, how to use it for searches, how to use it for adding to your own impressions as a journalist. But I think the challenge of the new media comes back to the basic challenge of what is journalism nowadays? What are we trying to do? Well, it's the same as it's always been, but it's slightly different form. The answer is we're trying to report a picture of the world, and particularly a picture of what is important in the world and what we ought to be focusing on if we want a better world. News, people often say, is always bad news. Well, of course it is, because if something was normal, it wouldn't be news. You're not going to have a news article saying 420 aeroplanes landed absolutely safely at London's Heathrow Airport yesterday. Nobody cares. It's perfectly normal. It's only news if one of them doesn't land safely. And therefore, people want to know what happened. Why has that gone wrong? And therefore, what is the exception makes news. Now, of course, many countries are always complaining that journalists, not only in England, but all over the world, are only writing bad news about their countries. They're only talking about disasters, floods, revolutions, corruption, crime, all these things. Well, the reason they do this is because we would hope that apart from that, everything is fine. In other words, apart from the floods and apart from the corruption and apart from all this, the country is working normally. But sometimes we have good news, and we used to write things from South Africa or the Middle East, where we say, in the Middle East, a new joint society of Israelis and Palestinians have formed a joint project for protecting the environment. And you say, this is good news. And then you think, why is it good news? The reason is we never expect good news from Israel and Palestine. We only expect something bad all the time. And when something good happens, it's an exception. So it's news. And the same, for example, in South Africa. You say the football World Cup was a huge success in South Africa. Everybody had a wonderful time. This is news because everybody expected there would be a disaster, that people would be robbed, that it would go wrong, something would happen. No, we focus on things that happen that need to be reported in order to show how to make the world better. We need to investigate what goes wrong, and we need to be balanced and fair in the way we report it. This is the same as it always has been. It's just a little bit more difficult now to do it. It's easier in some ways because you have a mobile phone and a satellite phone, and you can stand on a mountain in Afghanistan and you can tell the world what's happening, well, far from anyone. When I was a correspondent in Moscow many years ago, the Russians went into Afghanistan. And in those days, you couldn't just stand on a mountain and tell anyone. In fact, you couldn't even get a telex. You couldn't communicate. There was no mobile phone. There was no way of transmitting information. So what happened was a correspondent went to Afghanistan, and he had to wait until somebody at the airport was going back to London or the West. In fact, he found somebody going to Moscow from Kabul, and he said, when you get to Moscow, take this letter and give it to me. And I had to wait till he came with a letter with the description of what's going on. And this is only 30 years ago. And now it is much, much easier in communication. But it is much more difficult in many ways because everybody now is trying to control information. They're trying to make sure you publish something that is favorable, something that helps them, and there are also more direct threats to journalists who are reporting what people do not like. Nowadays, you will find more people, more journalists have been killed in the last 10 years than in all the years before that. Not only in Iraq, not only in the Middle East, quite a lot have been killed in Russia, sadly, quite a lot have been killed all around the world because they are a danger. They are reporting news instantly. And of course, now we all know that bad news can change not only a government, it can destroy a currency, it can destroy the entire authority of some politician. And they don't like it. And it's much more direct now than it ever used to be. And part of the reason it's more direct is it's not just journalists doing it, it's everybody with a mobile phone, it's everybody with a tape recorder, or who can transmit images and who can put a posting either on the internet or on the blog straight away. Which means the effort to control news is much, much greater, but at the same time, it's much more futile. It's almost impossible to stop the flow of news. You have to live in North Korea in order to be happy that you won't have journalists bothering you. Or possibly Belarus, but certainly North Korea. It is very, very difficult to try to cut off any country nowadays from the outside world. And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. But equally, it makes it quite difficult for journalists nowadays to know how to balance all the information they are getting. And this is a second challenge of the new media. It's to keep the right balance. If you have 10,000 websites that you could look at to get your information, how do you know which one to look at? If you look at one that is only going to give you xenophobic, right-wing, fascist-type views, you might think this is the best website. But if you only look at another one that is going to give you revolutionary views from Fidel Castro's brother or something like this, you think this is how the world looks. It's impossible, those are two extremes, but it's impossible to know whether a website is balanced or whether it is giving a special viewpoint on a particular subject. What you need, in fact, we are back to all the way back in the circle, you need a journalist for the website, or for all the websites. You need a journalist or somebody whose job is to sort out what is valid and what is not valid. What is a sensible posting and what is something that, frankly, you should ignore because it's a waste of your time. And how to do that is a real challenge. Now, I have to say, I think that journalism is beginning to diverge into several directions. Although I said all journalists now have to be able to do all different tasks, in fact, internet journalism or web-based journalism or even Facebook journalism, which is more or less journalism, democratic journalism by anybody who has a mobile phone, Facebook journalism is going in one direction and professional journalism is going in slightly the other direction. I think it's probably difficult to see an optimistic future for old-fashioned newspapers. The costs, as I say, are very great. The owners find it very difficult to make any money. Most owners now buy newspapers for prestige. All the owners of good newspapers are private. It's a very dangerous idea to think that governments can be more objective than private owners. The only guarantee for press freedom is to have many different rival newspapers that are competing, because no single newspaper can give a fully objective coverage, or a coverage that's completely without political bias one way or the other. And, for example, if the Times is centre-right, the Guardian is centre-left. If you have 2 or 3 newspapers covering the same story, the one that is wrong very quickly is visible if you compare it to the other 2 or 3 that are giving a better or more correct or more accurate version. So owners find it interesting to buy newspapers as a prestige product. But owners, of course, have their own views. Now, in Britain, we have Rupert Murdoch, who is a big owner of 4 newspapers, including the Times. We also have a former KGB agent, Lebedev, who has bought 2 newspapers in Britain. And a lot of people are thinking, my God, what are we going to have now? Are we going to have, pro-Russian KGB propaganda or something like this? Well, of course not. Because anybody who buys a newspaper, if you turn it into a propaganda organ, immediately nobody will read it. Because they will say, this is nonsense. We don't want to read this sort of stuff. If you want to make money in journalism, the only way of doing it is to provide good journalism. Accurate, fast, good reporting. And that's the only way you will have a prestigious newspaper. Now, some people are not interested in good journalism. Newspapers, on the whole, are not just to inform, they are also to entertain. And Rupert Murdoch also has quite a number of newspapers that, quite honestly, the definition of entertainment is completely different from the Times. We are lucky on the Times. We have a readership that is, on the whole, a sophisticated, educated readership. It's about 550,000 copies every day, but we know that we are talking to businessmen, lawyers, politicians, civil servants, well-educated people. We're not appealing to the same audience as The Sun. The Sun is a mass circulation newspaper for 3 million readers. But The Sun, on page 3, you will find a very lovely naked young lady. Well, that's not exactly news. That's what I would call entertainment. Or even, maybe that's not an entertainment, but it sells newspapers. The Times doesn't need to do that, thank goodness. That's not the way we sell our newspapers. But it means that all newspapers are appealing to different sections of readers. And that's why private individuals who buy newspapers have to know what is the audience. Again, I'm saying newspapers, it's quite easy to understand what is the market. If we're looking at new media, you don't know what your market is. Now, blogs, that's slightly different, because after a bit, blogs build up a market and a readership that is clearly defined. And this is particularly true in America, where they have built up some very good blogs, which are effectively newspapers. They're newspapers online. Huffington Post, for example, or several other ones. The Slate in America, that's a very good newspaper, Slate, I think, which is an online newspaper. And maybe one or two people who are regularly posting very intelligent comments on Facebook will build up a readership or a viewership or whatever it is. They will build that up slowly. But it's going to be very difficult for market analysis to say, yes, this group has got this A1, B2 group of readers, and this one has more lower income readers or viewers or whatever. That's the way newspapers work, and that's important for selling advertising, to know who the readers are. It's also very important, if you want to know who your readers are, in the way you write the newspaper. If you write the newspaper without giving enough historical background or enough information about something, thinking that everybody knows, you've made a terrible mistake. We have that sometimes on the Times. People think, oh, everybody knows where Tobruk is. Well, Tobruk is a town halfway along Libya. Now, anybody who remembers the Second World War will remember where Tobruk is, because there was an enormous battle during the Second World War when the Germans and the British Army were going backwards and forwards along the North African coast. But most people can't remember the Second World War. And you need to say, this is where this town is, and you need a map, and you need to show them, and you need more information, possibly, than you imagine you do. You should never overestimate the information you need to give. But equally, you shouldn't underestimate. You mustn't patronize your readers. You mustn't treat them like ignorant people. And unfortunately, again, with newspapers, it's quite clear who knows, who is reading the newspaper. It's not clear if you are trying to analyze something that is going out into the cyberspace where you're not sure how much anybody knows about the background. And I think that you can't do good journalism unless you know your readers. Same with television. You have to know who is watching, more or less. And this is important if you are trying to form public opinion. One of the key functions of newspapers, or journalism generally, is not only to reflect public opinion, but to form it, to be part of the democratic process. This is why democratic governments, they always say a free press is essential. It's essential for several reasons. Not only to keep a check on government. Of course governments don't like it. They don't like people criticizing them. They don't like people keeping a check on them. But they recognize that it's necessary. Because if newspapers don't say, this looks like a scandal, this looks like something wrong, if they don't say it, who else will say it? Who else will raise the questions? So you need them. You need a free press for democratic control, but you also need it to form public opinion. If you want a public that votes sensibly in elections, they need to be informed and they need to have opinions about things. And a press discussion, when I say press, of course it's television to the same extent, and radio. And in fact, nowadays, in Britain certainly, politics is done by the media. It's done in the media. It's not done in Parliament. Yes, everybody meets in Parliament and they make speeches and they think that this is the centre of all political activity. It isn't. The centre of political activity is a big discussion with 5 people once a week called Question Time, where the public ask questions of politicians and say, why did you say this? Why did you do that? That is where politics is. And newspapers and the traditional media are vital in order to reflect that issue. And newspapers, for example, invite politicians to write articles, where they also have, the Times has, a big page for letters. And letters are an excellent way of reflecting public opinion. It's a kind of two-way interaction. Now, you could say it's even better with interactive online journalism, because the moment you write an article, somebody will write underneath a blog saying, I don't agree, this is wrong, this is not true, and then you'll get another post saying, no, I was there, and then you have this long correspondence, and sometimes you have a really powerful public opinion former in the form of interactive media in cyberspace, or blogs, or responses to blogs, or all of that. But again, I come back to the point, who has got time to read it all? This is the big problem, especially the people you want to read it, who are not those who are meant to be studying for exams, or who are meant to be working. The people who should be reading it are the people making policy, the people who are running businesses, the people who have positions of power. They should be the ones reacting to public opinion, because they're the ones who are the most important in any democratic society in deciding what happens and what the government, or what government in general, is going to do. Now, I have to say, the whole question of new media is very often mixed up with the question of how free is the press? How free in any democratic society are we to say exactly what we like? Well, in some ways, the new media are even freer, because you can write what you like, and first of all, you don't have to check whether it's true, and you don't have to worry whether you will be sued for libel. Well, it's possible you will be sued for libel, but it's much more difficult to prove it, because very often you put a posting and then it's disappeared. You have to capture it very quickly to prove that you said something libel about someone else. The laws of libel are quite important checks on what newspapers can say. And in Britain, the laws are extremely strict. They are very, you have to be able to prove that what you say is true. And if you don't prove it, then it's possible you will have to pay a lot of money after a lawsuit. The other limitations on the media generally, as I said, they are cost, how much it costs nowadays to investigate things, and they are the physical limitations of simply distribution of newspapers, cost of paper, ability to reach the people you want to reach. All of these things are not really a problem if you are doing it in space. If you are sending out information on the net, or on the internet, or with a regular blog, you don't have to worry about distribution, you don't have to worry about where you're sending it. But there is one other interesting limitation on journalism, and that is, of course, language. Journalism is limited to the language in which it's written. And this is why, to some extent, the British press is in an amazingly advantageous position. Because it's written in English. It's not written in Finnish. Now, in Finland, they have some excellent newspapers. Helsinki Sanomat, a very good newspaper. But I don't know how many people outside Finland can understand it. And similarly, Frankfurter Allgemeine is an excellent newspaper in Germany. And although German is the biggest language in the European Union, the fact is, nobody in America, or very few people, regularly read German. And so the Anglo-Saxon press, the English language press, has this enormous advantage that it is immediately international and global. And this is an advantage that is magnified by the new media, because the language of the internet overwhelmingly, I mean, I'm lucky because it's my language, but the fact is, the language of the internet is English. There are very good outlets in other languages, and other countries are trying to promote the use of, say, French, or the use of Chinese, or the use of Russian, or whatever, on the internet. But if you look at the percentages, it's quite small still. And if you look at the percentages of people outside their own areas who are reading postings in other languages, it's extremely small. The number of people who are reading internet postings in English is enormous. And this is not only true of the Anglo-Saxon world, it's true, say, of a country such as India. India is 1.2 billion people. That's the same number as China. And of these people, at least 300 million have a working knowledge of English. About 60 million really speak it really well. Of the other 240 million, some frankly don't speak it very well at all. But they have a knowledge of English. And if you take that knowledge as a way of communication, this is an enormous market. This is the biggest English-speaking country in the world, much more than the United States, if you include partial use of English. So the fact of the language means that the freedom for people apart from the English language press is limited. You don't have the means to communicate because you don't communicate in the right world language. And that is something that, of course, we in Britain don't notice at all, because we're lucky, because it's our language and it's very easy to talk to people all across the globe. But it must be terribly frustrating if you are Dutch or if you are Finnish, because you have some marvelous writers and they're just talking to themselves in their own language. This is a real limitation of the press. The other limitations I've mentioned, well, they're obvious. They're the limitations of the journalist's own failings. Not all journalists are so balanced and so clever at getting the summaries right, getting the accuracy, for example. Not all journalists have high professional ethics. Not all journalists are hardworking. Some are simply extremely lazy. I won't give any examples, but I know many times you've heard the stories of journalists who simply make things up. And when they don't get caught, then you think, well, my God, how do we know that this is true? You can't be absolutely sure that this is an accurate and a good piece of journalism. On the whole, the more competitive the journalism is, the better. And this is why, although I think traditional journalism doesn't yet know how to use new media, it's a very, very good form of competition, because the new media are offering an alternative to traditional ways of presenting the news. And the more competition you have, the better, because that's the only way to guarantee variety of views and to some extent to guarantee freedom. I remember recently some German diplomat was very annoyed. There was a seminar with some journalists, and they were saying, the British press, it's so negative. You know, you're always attacking things. You're always attacking this, and you're always criticizing that. And what about the European Union? This is a wonderful thing for bringing people together after the Second World War, and of course for Germany it's very important. They said, but you people in England, you are always criticizing the European Union. Why can't your journalists be more positive and try to encourage an idea of support for this great new idea? And I said, you know, if you think that is the job of journalists in Britain, you don't understand the press at all. British journalists are like a pack of wild dogs. They will run all over the place, biting everybody they can see. They have no idea of... no journalist in Britain thinks, my job is to build the new Europe. They say, no. That's the job of diplomats, that's the job of government. Our job is to find out somebody who's doing something wrong and say, this is something bad, this is something sensational, this is something that shouldn't happen. And that is the view of how journalism should work. And the only way it works effectively is if it is competitive, if you have many different journalists trying to cover the same view. And again, as I say, the new media are wonderful competition because it offers to certainly a younger generation, a completely different way of looking at the news and a different way of reporting it. Now, how traditional journalists can accommodate that idea, I'm really not sure. And I would be very interested to hear your views on this, because we haven't found the answer. Some newspapers give a whole page of reporting blogs, but that seems to me the stupidest idea of all. If you want a whole page of writing out the best blogs you've read, just read them on the net. Don't read them in a newspaper. You're wasting a whole page of good possibilities of interesting articles. What is possible to read on the net, read it on the net. What you want to put on a newspaper is something that has to be special and separate and carefully thought through and carefully judged. And also you need comment in order to form public opinion. My recent job at the Times has been to write the editorials. These are the comments of the newspaper. And this is the opposite of objective journalism. This is not objective at all. It's very subjective. The aim is to have bias. The aim is to tell people, this is good, this is wrong. Because that is the point of comment. That's not the reason for analysis, and it's not the reason for reporting news. Reporting news, you should be balanced and careful, and you should be, if possible, objective. Well, most newspapers are not balanced, and they're not careful, and they're not very objective, but you should try. But if you're writing an editorial, the aim is to show people, this is the right argument, this is the wrong argument. And the aim of this is to stimulate a debate, and to stimulate discussion, and in this way be part of the democratic opinion-forming process. And that is what a good journalism ought to be doing, and it's the same now as it was before. Now, if you are reading a Facebook entry, in a revolution this is terribly exciting, because it is saying, come to Tahrir Square now, we are having a big meeting to protest. It's not saying, this politician has done the right thing, this one has done the wrong thing. That's not the aim at all. That's not where you're going to have editorial comment. The aim of a Facebook entry is to bring people together and to say, let me tell you something you didn't know. This politician is going to turn the army on us in a few hours. Be prepared and defend yourselves. They are fulfilling different functions. And I think both functions are important for democracy. But as you can see, I'm very old-fashioned in my view. And I think there is still a function for print journalism, for the old-fashioned paper such as The Times, 225 years old today, or this year I think, let me think, 1784, no, a bit more than 225, but quite an old newspaper. I think it still has a future, at least I hope it has. And if you think that the new media are the way to go, please tell me now in your comments. So let's take questions about everything now. Thank you.
Дякуємо, пане Майкле, за прекрасну лекцію. Можете... Отже, я закликаю аудиторію задавати запитання. Так, бачу вже першу. Хочу.
Can you tell us about about entirely new media.
Я перепрошую, задавайте, будь ласка, запитання.
Не могли бы вы рассказать о конвергентных медиа? Это новое направление, когда мы видим одновременно видеоряд, слышим аудио и читаем текст.
Yes, that's a very interesting development, and it's not only in journalism, but it's convergent media in many different things. For example, in art and in artistic production, we are seeing convergence, where you're getting video installations, and music, and film, and all different sensations all at the same time. I think that's quite interesting. I think it's not yet found a form that is easily recognizable, but certainly the use of video at the same time, is that working? Yeah. The use of video at the same time as the use of words is an extremely useful way of conveying information. Now, television already in some ways is a convergent media because you have pictures, you have sound, you have commentary, and you can also have text at the same time on the screen, or you can divide your screen and do it that way. Nowadays, newspapers are moving into convergence if possible. Obviously, on a piece of paper, you can't add sound, or you can't add smell, or something like that. But you can, on your website, you can add video, you can add commentary, and you can add graphics. Yeah, graphics and charts, as well as words and pictures. And most newspapers now have a video section. You see there's a little camera there, you look into the camera and you are voicing many of the things that you're writing. Sometimes nowadays when I write an editorial or commentary, immediately somebody from the newspaper comes along and says, now would you please make a video of what you've just said? And then I make a video, and sometimes even they also say, right, you make the video, you give the commentary, we will bring in some film or some archive material, and this we will give so that readers can see a bit more of the background. And of course you can bring in lots of things, maps, diagrams, charts, all these things are helpful. If you look at how traditional media have already changed, open any newspaper nowadays, there are far many more pictures than there used to be. There are many more charts, there are many more graphics, because it's an easier way of absorbing information. Sometimes words are really not enough. I found this myself very strongly when I was correspondent at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I flew to Berlin. I was there the next day when the wall was open, well, the gate was open, and the wall, people were standing on the wall. It was the most exciting thing I've ever done. I went straight to the wall and I said, you know, I want to get up. And somebody said, pulled me up to stand on the wall. I lost my house keys, but it was very exciting standing on the wall and seeing this change. And I thought at the time, my God, this is history. This is history happening now. But I also thought, television can do this 1,000 times better, because you have great difficulty expressing in words the excitement and the vivid scene of what was happening. You can do your best, but it's not as exciting as television. And certain events, you really need to see it to believe it. But on the other hand, how can television report a meeting of the Council of Ministers in Brussels where they're considering whether to change the regulations for banking? This is absolutely impossible to film. You have 5 or 10 or 20 ministers sitting there saying, yes, banking, you see, and then you have pictures of banks and you have pictures of people with money. The pictures are ridiculous. They're just something to put on the screen. The story about ministers meeting over a banking crisis is only able to be told in words. You can't tell it in pictures in the same way. So different events need different media.
Е,
Сегодня все говорят о таком создании, как гугловизор. То есть, возможно, что через несколько лет монополия на телевидение, она вообще будет потеряна. И можно будет как бы иметь в интернете свой телеканал. Скажите, пожалуйста, какой тогда будет информация, как это вообще, ну вот реально, и с чего это начинается, и к чему это приведет?
Well, that's absolutely true. Television is losing its monopoly, and it is that internet essentially is becoming the new broadcasting medium, and the internet is the way that you will find more and more competition to regular television channels. And television, television is finding the same problem that newspapers are finding now, that the internet is offering an alternative version, and sometimes a more direct and more interesting version, and indeed certain big internet operators, particularly search engines such as Google or engines like this, they are starting to be more proactive in the sense that they are offering an information exchange, either in the sense of some kind of televised offering that regular government television stations or even private television stations cannot compete with. They're offering something more rapidly and of course much, much more cheaply. Now, I think television is trying to say, just like newspapers, fine, we cannot compete in the same way with the new, as it were, amateur broadcasting that we're seeing being offered by television, by ordinary people on using new media. Television will say, we are offering you better selection, better entertainment, better selection of news, a more professional approach. And in this way, I think television is trying to fight back against the use of free media as a substitute. On the other hand, of course, it's much easier for television to use offerings on free amateur media, and very often now they use that, they have to use it, because if you want to film what's happening in Egypt during the first few minutes of a big demonstration, there's no cameraman there, there's only somebody with a telephone with a video possibility or even just still pictures. Or nowadays, whenever there's a big disaster, a plane crash or some big awful event, somebody is usually there to film it. And television has to buy the rights from whoever has taken that film. And usually it's quite a good deal. But I think television will say, okay, we're buying the piece of footage, we're buying the film, but we will present a better analysis of this event than you will find on kind of amateur broadcasting. I think television has been challenged by this, but I think it is able to respond quite effectively.
Учитывая то, что в Великобритании достаточно строгое законодательство относительно клеветы, скажите, пожалуйста, как часто Таймс получает повестки в суд и как часто проигрывает дела?
Well, it gets sued, it does get sued quite a lot, and we don't like it. And it's quite often, people try to use the laws of libel as a way of intimidating newspapers. Because the problem is, it's very expensive to defend yourself. So unless you are 100% sure that you are right, and unless you are ready to spend a lot of money in a court defending yourself, many newspapers will say, we better be careful here because this person is very dangerous. This powerful businessman is always trying to sue the newspapers. And we don't have the time or the money to defend ourselves. Now, most big newspapers have found that this threat is a real nuisance. And most of them will say, okay, go ahead and sue us if you want. It's like a game of bluff. You know, you try it, we'll respond. And sometimes they do sue. And unfortunately, Britain has these libel laws that are far too, I think, far too generous to people who complain. And they're so generous that we get now libel tourism. We get people from all over the world coming to Britain, specially to sue newspapers, because they can win a lot of money. And in fact, even Americans will come to London to sue the New York Times, because they say there are some Americans in Britain who read the New York Times in London, and therefore we complain about what they wrote. And the jury will give them a verdict. Sure, and now, how you make sure the money is paid, I'm not sure. That's much more difficult. But this libel tourism is a real problem. And the Times had a big problem with this about 5 years ago. There was some terrible Russian oligarch, I can't remember his name, maybe I won't tell you his name in case he sues me for libel, but actually I can't remember his name. He was some terrible mafioso bandit. And we said, this man is a danger. He's a real danger. And this man was so unwelcome that the British Security Service did not allow him into the country. He was banned from entering Britain. But he then sued the Times for libel, and what's more, he applied for a visa in order to come to the court and sue us. And the stupid government gave him a visa. And he came to London and he sued the Times, and we said, look, usually this man is not allowed into the country because he's such a bad guy. Why have you allowed him in this time? And we wanted to get MI6, which is the British intelligence service, to testify in court on behalf, because it was these people who said he's a very bad guy. And we knew this from security, liaison links. We had heard that they had already got a big file on this chap. But of course, MI6 is terribly secret. And they said, no, we are not going to appear in an open court. This is your problem. And he won a lot of money, because we couldn't prove what we said was true. And that was extremely annoying. Now, they're trying to change the law in some ways. First of all, they're trying to stop libel tourism. The second thing they're trying to do is to show that if a newspaper had good reason, and I think they say something like full justification for discussing a person's background or saying somebody was undesirable, if it was done without malice, in other words, if you were not trying to simply damage his reputation, but there was a reason for the public interest, then you can give the defense that this article you wrote was in the public interest, and that will limit the ability of the man to sue you for libel. So there are some changes to try to balance it, but it is still quite a problem for journalism.
Thank you for your very excellent. Я хотела бы задать 3, но очень коротких вопросов. Первый вопрос о цензуре. Считаете ли вы совместимый идеал демократического общества, связанный с социальными медиа, с феноменом цензуры?
Okay, I'll answer that one. No, censorship is always bad. Censorship will never give a democratic society the full range of opinion that it is entitled to have. There are some reasons why newspapers should not print everything they know. One reason is national security. And in Britain we do still have censorship on national security grounds. This is very, very rarely used, and it's known as a D notice. And this is if a newspaper is about to reveal a new secret location of a missile system, or some really, really secret piece of information that is likely to undermine national defense, then the government can send the editor a notice. It's known as a D notice, I don't know why, saying, please do not use this information on national security grounds. Now, it's not a law, it's a voluntary code, and it's possible that the editor can still say, well, I'm going to print it anyway. But if you do that, quite honestly, your relations with the government will be very, very bad for some time, and there could be some unpleasantness. It's not an actual censorship, it's a voluntary censorship. The other censorship, of course, that is very important is journalists' own self-censorship, not for political reasons, but for humanitarian reasons. Supposing you know, for example, that a soldier has just been killed in Afghanistan, but you also know that his parents have not been told, or that you know that his elderly mother is about to die, and you don't want to be the first person to print the name of the soldier in the newspaper before the elderly mother has heard the tragic news, or something like that. For humanitarian reasons, quite often journalists do not print things that they might know about. Or self-censorship also, if you are told something in strictest confidence that is off the record. Now, this is a very difficult question. Off the record. Off the record means that the government, or not the government, but somebody will tell you something which you're not meant to print, attributing it to that person. You can't say, I was told by Deputy Minister this and this and this. Well, it's not a law. You can still print it. But if you do, your relations with that person will probably be very bad for a long time. And you have to think, is it worth it? Do I need to ask this person questions again next week, and the week after that, and the week after that? It's up to the journalist to decide how to build a trustworthy relationship. So there are cases where newspapers don't write everything they know. But official censorship, I would say, in all cases, is a bad idea, except in wartime.
Спасибо, для нас это оптимистический идеал. Второй вопрос связан с так называемым рерайтингом и копирайтом. Рерайтинг. Дело в том, что в интернет-среде очень трудно защитить авторское право. И вопрос, считаете ли вы негативным явление, когда один журналист без ссылки на другого журналиста методом Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V делает новую публикацию?
It's lazy journalism. I quite agree. It's very lazy. It's undermining intellectual property. It is devaluing the work of other people. And also, of course, it's not journalism, because nobody is judging whether what you're copying and pasting is accurate or not accurate. I have to say, in some ways, this happens all the time, even in traditional journalism, using news agency reports. Because after all, if you're using Reuters or Associated Press or AFP, you're just taking a correspondent from Reuters and saying, you're using the facts and putting them into your own report. Well, to some extent, you have to trust that agencies that you are paying for are doing the job that you ask them. In other words, you have to trust that they are accurate. But you can do that, but just to copy somebody else's work and put your own name on top, this is very lazy. And it's even worse on internet sites, because nobody knows where you've taken it from. And as you say, the person who has written it cannot defend himself or herself. You can't say, that's my work, don't take it. It's very difficult, as we know, to police the internet. It's an open field, it's an open market. And if you want to make the internet valuable, then you have to see that some kind of journalistic standards are either enforced or expected. If you are looking at good journalism on the internet, as I was saying, certain blog sites where you can be sure that this person who's written something is writing what they think, or is saying, here is something I read last week, written by somebody else. If they say who it is, then you feel at least that's accurate and fair. But just to put a whole new publication with a piece here and a piece there and a piece there, it's bad.
Спасибо большое. И третий вопрос связан с книгой, которая наверняка вам известна. Она называется «Нетократия. Власть сети». Авторы Барт и Зондерквист. И авторы утверждают, что третье тысячелетие – это время, когда есть два класса. Один класс – это те, кто владеет информацией, это символическая власть. А второй класс – это пассивные потребители информации. Согласны ли вы с этой концепцией?
I think it's always been like that, and it's not just because of new media. I think there's always been a time where some people are simply consumers of information and some people want to create or distribute information. In the old days, it wasn't possible, unless you were a journalist, to have your voice heard elsewhere around the world. In the very old days, of course, you could print pamphlets. You could write your views on a piece of paper like this, and you could go and hand them out in the street. And it was like samizdat. I mean, it was your own way of distributing your own views. And now you can do it much more easily for millions of people by putting up a blog or posting or whatever. But of course, you don't know who's going to read it. You don't know how many people. Maybe nobody will read it at all, and you'll just be talking to yourself. I think the division of people into consumers and users of information, it's not really an accurate division, because at all times in our lives, sometimes we are consumers and sometimes we are producers. And sometimes we simply read what we find elsewhere. And of course, no journalist is any good if he doesn't read what other journalists write. If you don't read what somebody else writes, you've no idea how to form your own opinions. It doesn't mean you just copy, but at least you're listening to what other people are saying. So even a journalist has to be a consumer of other journalism. Otherwise, quite frankly, you're simply stupid. You don't know anything, unless you are such a genius that all your thoughts are completely original. Well, it's possible, supposing you are a mathematician with a totally mathematical, logical mind. You don't need to read other mathematical questions. You just work out your own. But this is not journalism. This is something completely different. If you are forming opinions, you need to read and consume other journalism.
По-перше, я хотіла би дуже подякувати вам, що ви приїхали до України і до Харкова. І в мене таке питання. Ви знаєте, що Україна належить до країн, що розвиваються. І я хотіла би знати, як на вашу думку, що повинно бути першим? Високоякісна журналістика чи високий рівень економіки і високий рівень заробітної платні у людей? Бо я маю на увазі, чи можуть бути люди, які мають там 2 пари взуття на рік, зацікавлені в високому рівні журналістики в країні, або навпаки журналістика мусить знати, що повинно людям, що в чому має народ потребу, і давати їм ці знання про їхні права. І дякую.
Well, I think the answer was given only a month ago in Egypt. In Egypt, there are millions of people who are extremely poor, but they decided accurate information without propaganda, democracy and freedom are more important at that moment for them than getting a higher salary. And therefore they were willing to demonstrate in the square and to risk their own standard of living falling, because all the time that there were demonstrations in Egypt, the tourist income completely disappeared, and Egypt depends enormously on tourism. And the result of these demonstrations is that the standard of living for most people will fall very sharply in the next few months. They will not have the income they were getting from all the tourists. But for them, it was more important to have dignity and truth and democracy. And they had had the other, they had had stability and no truth, and a slowly rising standard of living. It's not impossible to have both at the same time. And in fact, I don't think your standard of living will rise unless you have good journalism. Because, as I say, the point about journalism is that it should be a basis to strengthen democratic society. And democratic society is about making the right decisions. And making the right decisions is only possible if you know what's going on. If you don't know what's happening, how can you make any decision? You can make a decision if you're just one leader, if you have all the information, but you can't have a democratic decision, because nobody else will know what the facts are. And if you don't know what's happening, then you can't vote sensibly, and you can't influence either somebody in Parliament, or you can't influence other people to make sensible decisions. So it's absolutely vital that you have a journalism that is brave and courageous. Now, it's not always easy, and many people have asked me here, how can we get a good, robust, strong level of journalism immediately? First of all, they say there are big pressures on journalists. Secondly, we have only a few big, rich people who are controlling the advertising. And thirdly, we don't have a tradition of journalists being aggressive in asking questions of government leaders. Well, that's true. It's also true that you've only had 20 years to develop a free press. I mean, I remember when I used to come down to Ukraine before, and I used to read or see, you know, Pravda Ukraina, or whatever it was called. I wouldn't call this a free press. I mean, journalists did what they could, but within a framework. I mean, that was very limited what the framework was. I think you build up the tradition of good journalism little by little. You can't do it immediately. You can't make sure that newspapers are respected immediately. The other thing is, you can't be a brave journalist and attack some oligarch straight away and say, this man is causing terrible damage, and because straight away they'll send around some big guys who are saying, now you be quiet, and you keep quiet. But if little by little you build up a reputation as quite a good journalist and quite a reliable journalist, little by little your name and your publication will be known and respected in your society. And that means it will be more difficult for the big man with lots of money to make you keep quiet. Because if they try to threaten a very good journalist, the public outcry will be bigger. And people will say, you mustn't do that, this is a crime, you must. And effectively, you will create democratic conditions that allow a free press to flourish. It doesn't happen overnight. It can't do. And similarly, you can't say, well, we can't have a free press until we've got higher standard of living. How long will you wait? How high must the standard of living come before you have a free press? You need to do both at the same time.
Моє питання не стосується нових медіа, але я помітила, що працюючи у Великій Британії, я помітила, що молоді люди читають більше газет, не в інтернеті, а надрукованих. Я не можу судити про сільську місцевість, але у Лондоні це відбувається постійно. І може не тому, що вони більш освічені, а тому, що коли ти сідаєш у метро, наприклад, у Камдені, тобі дають безкоштовні газети. І вони кажуть, що навіщо нам купувати Таймс або інші газети, якщо нам кожного дня дають безкоштовну пресу. Я не знаю, ким вона фінансується. Яким би було ваша відповідь тим людям молодим, що це кажуть?
Yes, this is a very good question. A free press, in other words, one that you don't pay for. Is this a threat or is it a good thing? Well, in some ways it's a good thing, obviously, because if you have information that is free, more people will read it. But on the other hand, the question is, who is paying for it? Is it advertising, or is it some big oligarch? Well, one of our free newspapers is being paid for by a big oligarch, Mr. Lebedev, who has got the Evening Standard. And this is quite a good paper. But of course, the question is, if it's free, is it worth reading? Free newspapers very often don't have much money. And without money, your journalism will be very poor quality. It will perhaps be enough for 10 minutes in the underground train. After that, you'll say, there's nothing here. It's just advertising. Now, it's possible that if you have only one free newspaper, if you have many, it's useless. They're all very bad quality. If you have just one free newspaper, like at the moment we do in London, there's just one in the evening and one in the morning, they have a monopoly that advertisers find very attractive. Because if it's free, instead of 200,000 copies, they will print 1 million copies. And if you print 1 million copies, you can tell the advertising people, if you put an advertisement in our newspaper, you are reaching 1 million people. So the rate, the cost of your advertisement is 3 times more than it used to be. So that way you can actually pay for it, because the advertising rate is so much higher than it used to be. And for free newspapers, 1 or 2 of them, including the Evening Standard, have managed to become quite good, quite respectable, and quite interesting newspapers. And this is a threat for the daily newspapers, the ones you have to pay for, because they're not free at all. I mean, they're becoming more and more expensive. Now, young people, again, they read the free newspapers because it is now, thanks to, or rather not thanks to the internet, the mentality of everybody under 30 is, why should I pay for news? It's free. The BBC website is free. Internet is free. I can read it all without having to pay. So the mentality of younger people already is that news is not something I want to pay for, it is something I am entitled to read. And therefore, for them, free newspapers are quite attractive. And I think traditional newspapers haven't yet understood how to meet this challenge.
Дякую. І ще одне дуже коротке питання. Яке ваше відношення до каналів Ютуба, наприклад, і дуже коротких новин, які робляться не професійними журналістами, а свідками подій? Зараз вони дуже популярні. Дякую.
Well, YouTube is an extraordinary phenomenon, and I have to say, in many ways, marvelous, because on YouTube you will see clips of things that everybody is interested in, and this will have an enormous echo effect of something that has happened. And very often YouTube can reach many, many more people much more quickly. Well, the same with Facebook, the same with any of them. It can reach people much more quickly. The thing is, it depends what you put on YouTube. It's almost like a kind of rumor. If the rumor goes around that something really interesting is on YouTube, everybody is going to look at it. If it's just something ordinary, quite honestly, it's there for 10 minutes, it's there for 1 day, it doesn't really create any effect. But we had, for example, a phenomenon. We had one of these television shows where it's called Britain Has Talent, I think it was that one. Or the X Factor, I can't remember which it was. But there was this singer who is a middle-aged woman from Scotland who's never been seen before, who appeared on this program, and everybody thought, oh, she will be hopeless. And she opened her mouth, and she had the most amazing voice. And this clip on YouTube was seen by more than 2 million people. And suddenly this woman, Susan Boyle, has become a mega star all over Britain and also now in America, because it was seen on YouTube. And it was just, it was like a phenomenon. And there are a number of things like this. Sometimes very funny events, very funny things. Somebody has seen it, they've taken a picture, they captured it on YouTube, and everybody has seen it. And then newspapers have to catch up. Newspapers can't compete. Or television can't compete. Television sometimes has to borrow the clip or pay somebody for the clip in order to show it on ordinary television stations. So it is a phenomenon, and I think it's one that, on the whole, is very healthy, but it can be misused. Think how many times now we hear about children, school children, bullying each other on Facebook or YouTube, or children who are taking pictures. Many girls are being upset because boys are bullying them, taking nasty pictures of the girls and putting them on YouTube. And then everybody is laughing, and quite often you read about somebody who's committed suicide because they have been bullied by people using YouTube or Facebook or one of these social networks. This is irresponsible. You have to try to, for every new invention, there has to be a code of responsibility. Of course, it's easy to say there has to be, that very often there isn't, or there won't be. But it would be nice if there was a sense of responsibility.
Доброго дня. Я б хотіла повернутися до питання свободи слова. Якщо я правильно пам'ятаю, під час виборів у Білорусі відключали інтернет і соціальні мережі. А в якійсь із африканських країн також Фейсбук блокувався в певний час. І я веду до того, що зростають можливості нових медіа, і ще більше зростає їхня вразливість. Тобто, як включили інтернет, так і виключили. І другий пункт стосовно України. У нас нібито свобода слова є. Можемо зайти в інтернет, написати блог, але не відчувається, що українські медіа формують громадянське суспільство. Тому що скільки читаєш там кореспондент, зеркало тижня, наприклад, критики йде на нові реформи нашого президента, а публічний дискурс мовчить. В принципі, країна не реагує. І сказати, що зараз в Україні могла би бути революція така, як в Африці, в це не віриться. І я хочу почути ваші коментарі стосовно цього. Дякую.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I think the question of, well, take the second question first. It takes some time before media play a full role in national life, and it is partly a function of how democratic governments are in responding to public opinion. In Britain, governments sometimes are spending too much time worrying about what's written in the press. I wouldn't say sometimes, I say always they're spending too much time worrying about it, and very often they're only concerned with the image, with the picture that their government presents. They're concerned with the superficial things. They're not responding to actual challenges in policy, or not often they're not. And I think that you need governments that are responsive but not obsessed by media. Equally, the media can't expect that everything they do will automatically create a response in public opinion. Because sometimes people just say, oh, I can't be bothered. I'm not interested. It doesn't concern me. I'm interested in whether I'm going to get a bit more money for this job, or I'm interested in what's happening in my factory, or whatever. And if journalists or media are campaigning about the environment or something like this, sometimes people just say, I don't care. But you have to be prepared for that. Of course you have. It is often the case that campaigns don't succeed. Now, I just heard about a very interesting campaign here in Ukraine to protect the snowdrop, this flower that is in danger of disappearing. Now, this seems to me a wonderful campaign. But of course, if the media adopts this campaign and says, don't sell snowdrops if they're in danger of disappearing from the countryside, you can't be sure that everybody will agree. Quite often, it may not work. And people say, I don't believe it, these flowers are always going to be there. So you can't be sure that there will always be a response to a media campaign. Very often there isn't. And it just depends on what the issue is. Newspapers and journalists sometimes can feel public opinion, but sometimes they don't really get it. And if they don't get it, they quickly change their campaign or change their view. Remind me of your first question again.
Питання було про те, що дуже вразливі нові медіа разом із тим, що у них більше можливостей. Тобто швидкість повідомлення.
Yes. Indeed, they are also vulnerable. Yes, of course they are. And the more sophisticated the government, the more it tries to manipulate new media or to control new media. It's very difficult. The Chinese spend a great deal of money trying to block sites they don't like. They even take words. If you put Tiananmen Square in a Google search, nothing will come up in China. They also try really heavy pressure, like putting pressure on Google, saying you will only operate in China under certain conditions. And to their credit, Google said, okay, we're not going to operate in China. Because they said, you try to censor us, we're not going to be censored. And that just shows which one is the more powerful. All governments will try to control the internet some way, but they don't often succeed. Yes, they can close down access to the internet, but as we saw in Egypt, when they tried to cut off access, very many clever young people found a different route. They went out somewhere else, and then here, and then here, and then they came back a different way. Technology, if you understand it, is pretty easy to use in a way that can outfox governments. But you have to understand how to use it. And governments don't always understand how to control it. In fact, they don't understand at all. They try. If you have a completely totalitarian society, such as North Korea, maybe that will be possible. But even in North Korea, I think, some people will start to find a way to get a connection. Of course, if you don't sell mobile telephones, if you don't allow satellite dishes, if you don't allow computers to have any connection to the outside world, for a time you can seal off the information, but you can't really do it in the long term. And no modern society can really seal off or close information channels. It simply can't be done.
Добрый вечер. Большое спасибо за такую интересную лекцию. У меня два маленьких вопроса. Первый. Известно, что Англия одна из последних стран, которая приняла закон о свободе информации, доступа к информации о деятельности власти среди европейских стран. Около 6 лет назад он вступил в действие. И Хильтербрук, известная журналистка, она постоянно делает мониторинг и не очень высоко оценивает открытость правительства Великобритании. Ее известная книга «Тихое государство. Ваше право знать». А ваша оценка? Насколько английское правительство, правительство Великобритании является, по вашему мнению, открытым? Например, в сравнении с правительством Швеции.
Oh, compared to Swedish government, it's like a book that is closed and locked and sealed and put in a cave. It's completely different. In Britain we have a long tradition of secrecy. Everything is secret unless it's allowed. And indeed, for many years, everybody who worked in the government, in the civil service, had to sign, well, not everybody, but many people had to sign what was called the Official Secrets Act, which meant they weren't allowed to disclose information without authorization. Now, you're absolutely right. For many years, it was impossible to find out government information simply by asking. You could ask, and very often they wouldn't tell you. They then, many years ago, they passed a law saying that all government documents will be open after 30 years. Now, 30 years is a long time to wait, and there are some government records that still have not been opened 80 years, 90 years ago, especially, for example, the documents that are dealing with a king who decided to abdicate in 1936, King Edward VIII. He decided he was going to marry the lady he loved, and he gave up his throne, and his brother, George VI, came to the throne. Now, this was a big crisis in the monarchy, and all the papers relating to that have still not been made public, mostly because the Queen doesn't want them to be made public. But other documents are public, but 30 years is a long time to wait. So the more recent act, Freedom of Information Act, means that unless there is a reason of national security, if a newspaper puts in a response, the government is obliged to give an answer. Well, they find all sorts of ways of delaying. And sometimes the answer doesn't come back for almost a year. You will put in a request, for example, how many pounds were spent on, some project which was clearly a waste of money, or something that didn't go wrong. And they will say, the information is not available at the moment, but we're looking at it. We will come back with an answer. And then they will look, and you have to really push to get the information back. Now, Sweden is, for us, absolutely incomprehensible. Sweden, journalists have the right to read letters written to the Prime Minister before the Prime Minister has read them. I can't understand it. It's extraordinary. We saw the dangers of completely open government, where you have the United States State Department. They get all the telegrams from their embassies, and the United States was stupid enough to circulate these telegrams to 200,000 people. And of course, one of them is going to say, oh, this is interesting, we will leak it, and we will leak it to WikiLeaks. And they did. And of course, then the whole world knows what American diplomats have been saying around the world. And the WikiLeaks example is, first of all, it says two things. First, it shows if you really want to keep secrets, don't allow 200,000 people to read them. Only allow 25 people to read them. That's enough, or whatever. And secondly, it shows that actually many of the things that were kept secret by the American diplomats were actually should have been published anyway, because a lot of the information that they were sending back to Washington was extremely sensible and quite right. If you read what they said about Gaddafi or about Putin or about all sorts of people, you say, absolutely right. The problem is, of course, nobody in Washington was reading these cables, and so it didn't affect policy at all. But leaking information is an old tradition in every country, and especially in Britain, where it's always been secret, but somebody has always tried to leak something from time to time. That's not the best way of doing it. It's much better to have greater transparency and greater freedom of information. You can't allow everything to be public, otherwise no decision would ever be made. It would be impossible to make policy if everybody's arguments are instantly available. But once a decision is taken, it's perfectly reasonable to say, unless this damages national security, it should be possible for more people to have the information.
И второй маленький вопрос. Скажите, пожалуйста, по законодательству Великобритании блог является публичным местом? То есть, если блогер, если опубликовал информацию, и другой человек посчитал, что эта информация порочит его честь и достоинство, может ли он защитить свою честь в суде? То есть, будет ли это считаться распространением информации?
Yes, the law of libel. To be absolutely honest, I'm not sure. I don't really know the answer to that. I believe the law of libel is just as strict for bloggers as it is for printed journalism, because they now recognize that damaging somebody's reputation is perfectly possible through the internet, just as it is possible on radio and on television. There are two laws. There's the law of slander, which means if you simply speak something untrue, and the law of libel, which is if you write it. Well, a blog or even a Facebook posting is either slander or libel. It's either written or it's spoken. And if you can go to a court and prove that your reputation has been damaged, as far as I know, you can still sue for this. But it's much more difficult to find the evidence, because maybe the blog has disappeared. You know, it's been posted on the internet, and the next day you take it away. And so you have to capture the evidence to present it to the court. And sometimes that's more difficult. But in principle, as far as I know, the same law applies, yes.
Прошу задавати наступне питання, воно вже, мабуть, буде останнє.
Доброго вечора ще раз. Скажіть, будь ласка, у нас існує і газети, існує радіо, телебачення, інтернет-видання, тобто електронні. Чи може з'явитися ще п'яте джерело, звідки можна брати інформацію? І як, на ваш погляд, між газетою британською «Таймс» і харківською «Время» може бути якась спільна тематика, яка буде актуальною для нас і для вас?
Well, to answer the second question first.
Яке може бути п'яте джерело черпання інформації?
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll start with whether there's a new source of information apart from these things. Well, maybe, but I can't imagine what it is. I mean, maybe scientists will be able to work out the electrical brain waves that people, it's proven that the brain produces electricity, and you can now find that it is actually technically possible for somebody who is an invalid to control the mechanism of his chair or whatever simply by brain waves, by electricity from the brain. If you can do that, maybe you can put a blog simply by thinking about it. I mean, maybe one day that will be possible. I have no idea, but it's certainly true that the brain produces electricity which can be used. But I have no idea whether a new form of media will be evolved from this, or indeed any unusual combination of existing media. The question is, we don't know the answer because we don't know what technology will be capable of. Nobody thought that a telephone could now be something that can do almost everything in your life except cook your dinner. It can do so many things simply from the use of a telephone. Nobody thought that this would be possible only 10 years ago. So the evolution of technology, of course, may lead to new forms of communication. Now, whether there's a form of communication between the Times and the Kharkiv Times, it would be very nice, but I don't think it's likely. First of all, we don't have really enough in common. Britain has an old respect for and admiration for Ukraine as a country that has shown itself to be resilient in starting a new beginning. But I have to say, we don't print news about Ukraine very often. Only when there's some big event, like obviously the Orange Revolution, or changes, when you have Tymoshenko, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, and when you have change, when you heard about the fourth change, then we say, right, we've come back to the beginning again. And, or, for example, if there's a cut in the gas supply, or some big story. Occasionally, a correspondent will come here and will look in more detail at the general social development in this country, or for example economic reform, or some of the underlying challenges, or for example what Ukraine is thinking about in terms of relations with NATO, relations with the European Union, or indeed relations with other former Soviet states such as Georgia. What are the relations? And occasionally we write about those things, but we don't write about it very often, and therefore what you're writing about in the Kharkiv Times, quite honestly, mostly we would simply pay no attention at all, I'm afraid. But you can buy our articles if you want.
Ще одне останнє запитання.
Добрий вечір, Євген Ходун, журналіст. У мене два такі запитання короткі. Перше, ми знаємо, що є всюди в світі вороги вільної інформації, які всіляко намагаються обмежити її поширення. В Радянському Союзі це було заглушування радіостанцій, наприклад, те, що в деяких громадських мовах називається бруяж. Тепер цього не роблять. Технології змінилися. Тепер просто викидається великий обсяг інформаційного сміття, яке доступне. Коли людина щось хоче узнати, то воно перше, що трапляється під руку. І вона вморюється, вже в неї не вистачає способу шукати релевантну, суспільно значущу інформацію. Наскільки це явище поширене в світі, і, можливо, воно навіть навмисно робиться. І друге запитання. Кореспонденти світових засобів масової інформації, наприклад, в Делі, він оглядає десь четверту частину земної кулі, південноазіатський субконтинент, можливо, ще Індокитай і так далі. Чи може він оцінити релевантність події, які відбуваються не поряд, а десь отдалік? Наприклад, ми маємо кореспондентів у Києві, а вони знають, що робиться в Харкові. По всьому світу прогреміло повідомлення з Кот-д'Івуару. Президент Багбо відмовився йти у відставку, хоча проти нього проголосували, тільки тому, що йому захотілося бути далі при владі. Те ж саме або подібне було у Харкові, правда не з президентом, а з виконувачем обов'язків міського голови. Але про президента шумлять всі засоби масової інформації, а те, що в мільйонному місті посеред Європи, у великій країні, не звернув уваги ніхто, бо це не столиця і не президент. От як ви дивитесь на добір релевантності інформації? Дякую.
Okay, let's take the second question at the same time. No, I'll do this first, but otherwise I'll forget your questions. Yes, information noise. This is absolutely true. There is so much information now, it's sometimes very hard for a journalist to find the relevant information. In the old days, it was a case of blocking information. As you say, for example, some countries used to block radio broadcasts using jamming, electronic jamming, block radio broadcasts. This was very crude, it didn't often work, and all it did was to make people more hungry to get the information. Now there is so much information that actually it's a very clever defense. Very often, sometimes, governments will use this technique in order to drown bad information. And it's an old technique which is to put out bad news on a bad day. In other words, some terrible thing happens. For example, the 9/11 attacks in New York. And there was a famous case in Britain where a minister's aide sent an email to the minister and said, I suggest we release the news about, I think it was about railways, some really bad information about railways that were either losing money or something like that. This is a good day to release the news because they knew that nobody would be paying any attention because they were all looking at these terrible events in New York. Actually, that email was leaked and somebody found the email and the person who sent the email was sacked because they said this is a terrible, terrible attempt to manipulate information. But it is true that usually governments also think, what is a good day to put out good information when we will have lots of publicity, and a good day to put out bad information? So you will sometimes find that information that is not very helpful, the information about some bad scandal or bad figures or something, the government will release the information at 5:30 on Friday afternoon. Because they know it's too late for the newspaper, and Saturday nobody cares, and then by the time it's Monday, nobody's paying any attention. And on the other hand, if they have really good information, they will either do it on Sunday afternoon, because they know the paper on Monday is almost empty, so we need news to fill up the newspaper, or they will release it on Monday morning when everybody is fresh and ready for work, so that there's lots of publicity about it the next day. This is one attempt to drown things. And it's very true in Britain, and journalists are quite aware of this, and they are watching to see whether this is happening. The second question about reporting things when you're not there, reporting information, for example, about what's happening in Ivory Coast or what's happening in Egypt. Now, if you have never been to Egypt, or you've never been to Ivory Coast, it's a bit dangerous to report it from Kiev or from London or from somewhere, unless you have some special contacts there. If you can report it, if you are looking at world news sources, for example, Reuters or AFP or something, it's, as I say, it's cheating if you pretend it's your own news. But if you have been there yourself, if you have been to Egypt or you have been to Ivory Coast and you have talked to people maybe last year, then it's quite possible to add a sensible and sometimes useful comment of your own. And in fact, I have to say I'm guilty of this myself, because I've been to Egypt many times and I've interviewed some of the senior Egyptian politicians, and when all these events happened, I remember what Egyptians used to tell me 5 years ago, how they were fed up with these politicians, how angry they were about their dignity was being ignored. So when these reports came, I was able to add a commentary with some background information. But it's hopeless to report on what's happening in the mayor of a city from far away if you don't know the city. You can't possibly give any useful background or any useful information. And so actually, if you're trying to report it all from just sitting where you are, it's a waste of time. But at least try to make a telephone call, or 1 or 2 telephone calls, to the place where you're writing about, to find out the atmosphere and what's happening. The only thing you can usefully do is use your own background information to add something to reports that you may get from somewhere else.
На жаль, наша зустріч підійшла до завершення, на жаль, ми обмежені в часі. Пане Майкле, дозвольте ще раз вам подякувати за надзвичайно цікаву лекцію і за не менш цікаву розмову. І приїздіть ще раз до Харкова, будемо раді вас бачити. Дякую вам.